Good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange team and partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Increasing Integration of Pollinator-Friendly Forbs and Wildland Restoration, presented by Byron Love, Ph.D. candidate at Utah State University and technician at the USDA ARS Pollinating Insects Research Unit. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you may ask questions of the speaker or me at any time during the webinar by typing your questions into the questions pane of your control panel located at the top right of your screen. I will keep questions for the presenter in the queue and field them after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio pane and check your audio selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Byron Love is a Ph.D. candidate at Utah State University and works as a technician for the USDA Pollinating Insect Research Unit in Logan, Utah. His research focuses on the response of native bees to wildfire in Great Basin sagebrush steppe habitat. He received his master's degree from California State University, where he investigated the influence of urban and agricultural land use on native bee diversity. Welcome, Byron, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, I'm making you the presenter.
How does that work?
Perfectly.
Great. Well, thanks, Janie, and thanks to all of you who are attending this webinar. This is my first attempt at this, so hopefully I won't accidentally put up any videos of cats this hour. Our work has been a part of a larger collaborative with the BLM, the Forest Service, and the Great Basin Native Plant Project. And we've been working to restore degraded habitat in what has been called one of the most imperiled large terrestrial ecosystems in the United States. The fire regime in sagebrush steppe is typically measured in decades in intact sagebrush steppe. One reason for this long interval has to do with the sparse distribution of the native shrubs, the bunch grasses and forbs that make up the dominant component of this plant community. The interspaces are held in check from erosion by a biological soil crust, creating a discontinuous fuel bed which, when fire does occur, it doesn't travel very well. As a result, smaller, low-intensity fires create a patchwork of various age classes with a surprising diversity of plants and animals. And unfortunately, as is all too common, this system has been experiencing a downward spiral of weeds and fire due to the typical laundry list of human-caused insults. The introduction of highly competitive non-native annual weeds like cheatgrass has transformed much of this system into a monoculture of highly flammable fuels. The lack of interspaces creates a continuous fuel bed early each spring, which results in larger, higher intensity fires with fire return intervals now measured in years rather than decades. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of bee pollinators in providing an essential ecosystem service that's necessary for the persistence of many of the native perennial forbs in the Great Basin, as well as some of the challenges and limitations that we face in getting these plants back into degraded sagebrush steppe. I also hope to give you a better understanding of native bee diversity and their natural history, because I think that that will help aid you in incorporating bees into management and policy decisions. So once a fire burns through, especially with these larger and more severe fires that are becoming all too common in the Great Basin, it's necessary to get something on the ground as soon as possible to minimize further damage from soil erosion. Typically, this has been from grass seed, both native and introduced species. And these species are relatively inexpensive to produce. They establish quickly, and they do a good job at providing erosion control, as well as providing grazing opportunities. But they are limited in providing necessary resources for other wildlife, like sage grouse and native bees. Forbs, on the other hand, are very expensive, and they've proven difficult to establish, but they are vital if we expect to retain native wildlife. Millions of pounds of seeds are procured and deployed each year in the Great Basin. The amount fluctuates depending on the fire year, and unfortunately there's no reason to believe that fire activity is going to decrease anytime in the near future. So as the graph in the upper left shows, that over 60% of the annual buy is made up of grass species, with shrubs and forbs making up the balance. And you can also see here that grasses are less expensive per pound than either shrubs or forbs. And of the forbs that are procured and included in seed mixes shown in the lower left graph, the vast majority, about 80%, are introduced species such as blue flax. Now, one obvious reason for this disparity can be seen in the cost per pound of seeds. The introduced forbs cost much less per pound than native forb seed. For instance, Lomatium dissectum costs well over $100 per pound compared to $6 a pound for linum. Now, linum and Achillea, flax and yarrow, are the two most common forbs used in the mixes that we've seen in the field. Cost is clearly an important consideration in their use, as is their success in germinating and growing under field conditions. But so too is their utility to wildlife, including bees. And we found that bees have rather discerning tastes regarding these less expensive species. This figure shows that flax and yarrow are about as popular with bees as broccoli and Brussels sprouts are to 7-year-old kids. That's to say, not very. Arrowleaf balsam root, on the other hand, the most popular choice of bees, isn't even on the buy list typically, and it's not surprising given the problems that we have in getting seeds from agricultural production. Most of the plants that we've worked with in the Great Basin depend on pollinators to increase seed set, sometimes dramatically, as seen with Lomatium dissectum and Hedysarum boreal, that experience a 60 to over 100-fold increase in seed set in the presence of bees. And this brings up two important implications. First, bees are needed to maintain populations of forbs in restored habitats. That is, even if we're successful in establishing these forbs, their persistence is not guaranteed without the presence of a local bee fauna. And second, bees are also needed in agricultural landscapes where these seeds are often produced. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we get seeds from agricultural landscapes. Pollinators here are only one of the challenges faced by seed growers in producing seed for use in these restoration projects. Growing perennial forbs for seed production is way beyond my abilities, so I'm not even going to attempt to talk more than just briefly about it. But I want to point out some of the more obvious challenges, like just figuring out how to bring a new species into cultivation. Growth rates are also important. Some plants like Lomatium and Balsam oryza can take many years to reach maturity, which requires a considerable investment in time, labor, and space before any seed is produced and brought to market. And even if seed is produced on the plants, collecting them from species with explosive seed dehiscence or fluffy achenes that blow away in the slightest breeze, it can be problematic, to say the least. Getting pollinator services in these systems can also be a challenge, especially in habitats under intense agricultural production. Frequent use of chemical controls and fertilizers, the removal of weedy flowering species and hedgerows, and large monocultures of non-pollen producing crops such as grains are not conducive to retaining a local bee fauna from which we can draw on for their pollination services needed to grow the seed crops. Even if there are nearby flowering crops like beans, for instance, these monocultures only provide a quick pulse of pollen and nectar that bees can use, and in itself it's not enough to provide the resources required for an entire bee community. So one alternative has been to turn to honeybees. They're the most common crop pollinator, and they certainly have a place in commercial pollination. And we can also use them to pollinate at least some of the specialty crops of Great Basin forbs for seed production. Unfortunately, they're not always the best or efficient pollinator. On the other hand, some solitary bees can be managed for use in pollinating seed crops, especially from the genus Osmia and Megachile. These bees nest above ground in cavities that in nature are found in pithy stems and twigs, and also in the burrows of wood-boring beetle holes in dead snags. Artificial nest substrates can be made from natural stems or straw paper, paper straws, like the two that I have pictured at the top of this slide. The reed on the top has been sliced open to reveal individual nest cells that contain pollen and nectar provision masses along with their eggs. In the lower picture is an X-ray of a nest that's inside of a paper straw. And I hope you could see on the left side of the straw there's some adults. I guess the first cell to the left and then the third cell, those have adult bees in them. And then there's developing larvae more to the right. So with this kind of a system, farmers can manage these bees by bringing them in after pollination is complete. They can cool them off during the winter to simulate dormancy. Then they can incubate them the prior spring before bloom and release them when they're needed. Most bees, however, nest below ground, and as a consequence, they're much more difficult to manage, at least to the degree that cavity nesting species can be managed. Nonetheless, it's not difficult to steward agricultural land in ways that will promote the persistence of these species. For instance, setting aside hedgerows and providing nesting substrate and limiting the use of chemicals are ways that we can promote local bee diversity. In addition, planting extra forage can extend the flowering season, which increases both the abundance and the diversity of bees that would then be available for seed crop pollination. In our research, we've seen many examples of these practices that result in the increase of native bees on farms. Some bees, like bumblebees, are generalists that are capable of pollinating a wide range of plants, but it's also possible to attract specialist bees that depend on plants from a specific family or a genus for their pollination needs. Bees from the genus Diadasia, for instance, they specialize on globe mallow, which is one of the desirable forbs for Great Basin restoration. And these specialist bees are much better, they're much more efficient at pollinating Sphaerosia than honeybees. And they also do it for free, so long as they have suitable nesting and other floral resources. The commercial production of seed crops is an important first step in reducing the cost of seed. This in turn provides us more resources for restoration work. But seed crops also serve bees in another way. First, on the farm, they provide resources for local bee faunas in habitats that are typically really marginal at best. And second, we estimate that for every acre of cultivated land, 200 acres can be restored for habitat for pollination conservation. And I think that that's a pretty good return on your investment. Increasing the availability and diversity of native forb seed is an important step in restoring degraded wildlands. But all the seed in the world is worthless if it doesn't ultimately grow in field conditions. The use of seed drills for grasses and some forbs, remember that broccoli and Brussels sprout example, it's a quick and effective method of sowing seeds in large tracts of land, and it's necessary to get out seed quickly in order to prevent soil loss. But this method is not ideal for many of the forbs we're interested in due to limitations of the equipment, specific soil and habitat requirements of the forbs, and inadequate precipitation following planting. The end result is often poor establishment. Now, given the high cost of seed, I think it might be worth considering trade-offs between large-scale plantings using these kinds of seed drills with other smaller-scale efforts that may be more expensive per individual plant, but they might result in a higher overall success. For example, maybe the use of plugs or small-scale seedings in more high-quality microsites, that might be a better alternative than mass seeding with drills, even if it would be more expensive per individual plant. We're also exploring the use of row cover and snow fences as a way to increase the moisture availability in microsites. And again, these methods are more expensive per plant, and they can't be used over vast expanses, but they might provide well-established islands that could then expand naturally over time. So I've shown that the presence of bees are important for increases in seed set for many Great Basin perennial forbs, and I've outlined some of the challenges that we face in getting more of these plants into restoration projects. But what about the bees in these degraded habitats? Are they even around? Looks like my slide didn't work on this one, so I'm just going to have to wing it a little bit. The short answer really, unfortunately, is yes. We've found that adult bees can survive the passage of a flame front and they'll continue nesting if the fire hasn't consumed all the available bloom. Immature life stages also survive in their nests, and they'll emerge the year following the fire. Now, of course, there's going to be some exceptions. Some species are more vulnerable depending on the natural history of the bee, like their nesting floral, habits, their floral preferences, and when they fly. Fire characteristics like the season of the burn, the severity and intensity, and the total area burned can also have an influence. But we found that in general, a bee fauna can remain relatively intact after all but the most intense fires. So this is good news, but it also means that the presence of bloom in that first spring post-fire is really critical if we want to retain that surviving bee fauna. Some perennial forbs, like the Lomaceum balsa myriza, are fairly resistant to fire, but in some cases it might be useful to consider the addition of quick-blooming perennials or maybe even annuals into the seed mixes in order to carry bees over while the slower-growing species establish. Oh, there it is. So, who are these bees that I keep referencing? Well, in speaking to the general public and land managers over the past years, I found that while in general our awareness of the importance of pollinators has increased, this increase is due to a very atypical bee, Apis mellifera, the honeybee. Consequently, there's a disconnect between what the average person understands a bee's needs to be and what the average bee really needs. And if you consider that the honeybee is one of over 20,000 species of global bee diversity, that's a pretty small representation of bee diversity. This map here in the background of this slide represents bee sampling efforts in the western United States, and the Great Basin Sagebrush Steppe is outlined in brown in the center. Over 1,000 species have been identified so far in this area, and this is without any really rigorous surveys. Bee diversity includes morphological differences in size, shape, structure, and these can influence the floral needs of different species. But there's also spatial and temporal differences which need to be considered when managing plant and bee communities. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time to illustrate some of this diversity and how it relates to wildland restoration. As I'm sure you all know, honeybees are social, right? They have a queen that's responsible for the production of eggs, and many thousands of daughters are responsible for everything else, like brood care, nest construction and maintenance, pollen and nectar foraging, security, stuff like that. Honeybees are perpetual, and by that I mean that they don't really have a beginning and an end unless they die of disease or some other stochastic event. Instead, they reproduce by splitting off workers and new queens, which then fly out and establish new colonies. Now, all of these behaviors, the colonies, the queens, the workers, brood care, these are all unique characteristics of social insects. And while there are other social bees, for instance, bumblebees, this social structure is by far atypical. The average bee, instead, is what we consider solitary. Solitary bees emerge in the spring or summer from small nests, most commonly in the ground, but also in twigs, stems, and wood cavities. The females mate. They begin the construction of their own nests, which consist of individual cells that are provisioned with just enough pollen and nectar to raise a single offspring. An egg is deposited on the provision mass, the cell is sealed, and that's the last contact the female has with her young. She'll continue to provision cells throughout her short adult life, which is typically only about 6 weeks. Inside the cell, the larva develops, and it'll emerge the following year to repeat the cycle. To illustrate this, here's another way to look at that. This is a solitary bee's life cycle, and as you can see, the majority of a bee's life is spent inside of the nest, either as an egg, a larva, a pupa, or sometimes as an adult. So this short adult lifespan, it begs this question of how is it that if a bee flies for only 6 weeks, we see bees in the environment for up to 6 months? How can that occur? Well, much like the phenology of a plant community, bee species can be early season, they can be mid-season, late season, or even overlapping and even long seasons. So while we may see bees visiting flowers the entire season, they represent a suite of different species some that overlap, some that don't. And most of the bees in the Great Basin, they fly during the spring, taking advantage of many of the forbs that I've talked about today, like Lomatium, Astragalus, Penstemon, Balsamorrhiza. But there's also a summer pulse of bees that rely on late-season Asteraceae species like rabbitbrush and Helianthus. So full flowering seasons are not only important for providing resources to early or late-season bees, it's also important for other social species which have a longer flight season, a longer development to reproduction. And so having this longer season is beneficial for a larger bee community. So there's a number of ways that bee communities can be organized. I've talked about this sort of temporal organization. They can also have spatial distribution, where you have some bees that are common to many sites, while others sites are very rare. You could also have rare bees that are pretty common, but you never find them in large numbers. We can also have endemic populations that are common in some sites, but absent in others. And nesting and floral preferences can also structure a bee community. So I talked about two nesting habitats, underground and cavity nesting. And I'll review this just a little bit here. Most bees do nest underground. Their cells can be anywhere from a few centimeters below the surface to over a meter deep. And I am always impressed by this. I mean, if you think about it, try digging a well with your mouth and see how that works out for you. It's really impressive that these little bees can dig such deep burrows. I've also mentioned that they use nests in stems and wood cavities. Some species can also exploit cavities in rocks. They can build freestanding nests of pebbles, mud, and resin, and they can even use other items like this empty snail shell on the top right that's been cut in half. You could see there's a couple of larvae in there on their provision masses. So I think by now you can get a feel from all this nesting diversity that there are going to be some species that are going to be of greater and lesser risks to disturbances like fire. Small, low-intensity fires can retain patches of all nesting types, while larger, higher-intensity fires could wipe out all above-ground nests and even some of the shallow, below-ground nests. This figure illustrates a common pattern of nesting habits in the Great Basin bee communities that we've been studying. You can see here that the majority of bees are indeed below-ground nesters, and there's a much smaller proportion of the bee fauna that nests above ground. This figure can also give us a glimpse into the floral preferences of bees and how they organize themselves in a habitat. So for instance, the small group of bees that we've collected from the genus, or from the fernleaf biscuit roof, come from the bee genus Micrandrina. On the other hand, arrowleaf balsamroot and basalt milkvetch provide resources for a much broader range of bee diversity. Understanding the plant pollinator network of a habitat is also important in guiding us in restoration decisions. So this confusing figure here is typical of one such network. It shows the complex relationship between bees and plants. As informative as it might be for some, for us, I think I'm going to simplify it just a little bit here. I think it's common for people to, when they think about a plant pollinator mutualism, they use an example like this, where you have one bee, in this case Andrina astragali, and one plant, the death camas. You've got one bee, one plant. The plant provides the pollen, the bee provides the pollination. Now, while these types of highly specific mutualisms do occur, they're very rare, and they're also very susceptible to some kind of an event. You lose the plant, you lose the bee, the entire relationship collapses. These are often the focus of conservation efforts, and rightly so, because they are vulnerable, but they can soak up a disproportionate amount of our limited resources for restoration work. More commonly, here is the generalist mutualism. In these cases, you've got, looks like that's a fancy slide there, excuse me. In these cases, you have one bee species that can get its pollen source resources from a number of different plant species, And similarly, you have plant species that can be pollinated by a number of different bees. And this redundancy means that the loss of one or a few plants or bees in a habitat won't result in the entire collapse of the system. Now, these are the areas where we can get the most out of our limited resources. So in addition, the addition of a single generalist forb, for instance, can provide pollen for multiple species of bees. But if the goal is to retain a specialist bee like that globe mallow specialist diadasia, then it's really important that we include Spiralsia into the seed mix. So to summarize here today, bees are necessary for the pollination of many important Great Basin perennial forbs, both on farms for the production of seed crops and in the field for the persistence of plant populations. Likewise, retaining bee faunas requires the presence of adequate and appropriate bloom at the right time. Increasing forb diversity and restoration efforts will require innovation to decrease seed costs and increase successful plant establishment. Understanding the nesting and floral needs of bees as well as their social structure and seasonality are important natural history traits that can better guide us to the use of our limited restoration resources. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity, and I'm guessing we've got time for some questions.
Yes, thank you so much for the great presentation. If you have questions for Byron, please type them into the questions pane of your control panel at the top right of your screen. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have a question about, so you were talking about large-scale drill seeding methods and how that often, doesn't work very well to, get forbs into the system. So, so you talked about maybe smaller plots or smaller microsites would be better for restoring. And so, have there been examples of this?
Well, we're working on one right now. We're working with snow fences, using snow fences that can accumulate snow over the winter and provide a sort of a pulse of water throughout that early spring. So you can't have snow fences throughout the habitat, and in some places where it doesn't lend itself to snow fences, obviously it's not going to work. So yeah, we're starting some, and I'm sure that there's been other methods that have been tried, but these are the two that we're working on: is snow fences and then the use of row cover, where you put the row cover down, it holds the moisture in the soil a little bit longer, and then you take it off later in the spring. The more labor for sure, but if we could get islands established, then that might be a better alternative to this mass seeding.
Great, thanks. All right, Katie Grenier asks, what recommendations do you have for protecting nesting sites for ground bees after a large fire?
Well, that's the great thing about ground nesting bees is you don't really have to do much for them. They take care of themselves. I think, especially in restoration projects where there's really any kind of tilling with say, seed drills is going to be relatively shallow. And so that's not going to disturb any of the deeper nesting bees. So it's kind of a bonus. You don't have to do much for the ground nesting bees. Providing them with floral resources is really the key in that instance.
Okay, great. And then Katie follows up with a bit of clarification. So if there's a fire and then I guess a large-scale seeding afterward, what can you do to protect bee nesting sites?
Yeah, like I say, with the methods that we use to put the seeds in the ground, it's not going to disturb the soil enough to impact any of the ground nesting bees. It seems counterintuitive that even in an agricultural system, if you have this deeper tilling, that you're going to be disturbing the main burrow entrances for deeper ground nesting bees. If they're a shallow nesting bee and they're within the depth of the tines of the farm equipment, then you might have some disturbance there. But the ones that are below that disturbance, a lot of times they can find their way out anyway, the young. So that would be one of the least important factors, I think, to focus on after a disturbance. It's more getting seeds out there that are going to provide the forbs for the bees that are surviving the fire.
Great, thanks. Claire DeLeo asks, is diadasia bees found throughout the West? We are interested in growing scarlet globe mallow for seed increase.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would have to ask you to maybe email me separately, and I could get some of that distribution range, the data. I don't have it offhand. What I have found in the West is that I'm not sure how it works, to tell you the truth. We'll find Sphaeralsia patches in the middle of nothing else, and you'll see diadasia. Here in Logan at our research garden, we planted diadasia, and a few years later they showed up. So they're moving across the landscape in ways that we're not entirely clear on. They'll find it. Plant it and they will come. How's that for an answer?
That's great. All right, Kelly Evans asks, I like the idea of islands. Is there a recommendation on how large and how far apart these islands would need to be effective?
No, and that's something that I'm really interested in. I think the use of islands might be something that we've overlooked. You know, you don't see a lot of these forbs growing in even dense patches throughout the landscape. They're in islands. They're patchy. So I think that by simulating what we find in nature, we might be onto something. So all I can say is let's try it. Let's see what happens.
Great, thanks. Cheryl Shippentauer asks, you mentioned two practices, snow fences and row cover and removal. Can you explain more on row cover?
Well, that it's a lightweight fabric, and I've been working with, I think it's Scott Jensen from the Provost Shrub Lab, who's used it before with in other projects. You can put it out in the environment, you stake it down. It's my understanding that you can sometimes just leave it and it will degrade naturally. Solar exposure is going to degrade the fabric fast enough to where you get the retention of the water, but the plants can then grow free afterwards. Or I guess in some cases it may be the plants grow a little too fast. You'll have to go back and pull it off. I'm not sure what else I can say about that.
Okay, if you have follow-up questions, Cheryl, you're welcome to type them in. Do either of you have questions?
I was going to ask if you about...
Hey, wait, hold on a second. Charlie Duncan has a question. She's with me in my office, so she'll ask.
Okay. I wanted to, you're talking about restoration after fire. What about restoration planting after treatments, fuel treatments, where you're masticating and mulching the ground and treatments like that?
Sure. I talk about fire in general terms just because it's been the focus of my research, but really fire is just another type of disturbance, one type of disturbance. So these other fuel reduction treatments where you are doing a lot of masticating, it's basically another disturbance. So if you think about what's happening with the bee community, where there's going to be a treatment, if you're masticating trees that are not being utilized by cavity nesting bees, then that's not going to have an influence on that type of bee, right? If, on the other hand, if you have bees, if there's beetle burrow holes in these trees, if they're dead snags, it's probably not a bad idea to leave some of those in the environment. And as far as mulching the ground, that can be problematic for some of the ground nesting bees. They have difficulty getting through really thick mulch. So I don't have any information on wildland mulching depths. I know we talk a lot about urban gardeners, and their mulching practices can really influence in a bad way the use of ground for ground nesting bees. So there must be some maximum depth of mulch that is going to discourage ground nesting bees. I would guess in general, if you if you, like anything else, if there's heterogeneity in the habitat, if some ground patches are left bare or with relatively thin layers of mulch, you're going to be okay.
True. Yes. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Well, that looks like the last question. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey of this webinar that will appear after the webinar has ended. A recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, and will also be posted on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website, hopefully in the near future. Our 11th webinar in the series, titled The Natural Resource Conservation Service's Role in Developing Native Plant Material for Federal Land, presented by Derek Tilley, will take place next Wednesday, April 8th. If you have more questions regarding this webinar or have requests for future webinars, please email or call me anytime. And it looks like Byron has also provided his email address as well. So thank you all for your participation today, and thank you so much, Byron, for your presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Right.